I grew up Lutheran. I've shared this with you before. And we went to a church just down the street in Danville called All Saints Lutheran Church. And I'll be able to see if any of you are actually from here or if you're all immigrants, like I think you are. Who knows where All Saints Lutheran Church was, besides my brother? Valbrosda? Your cousin went there. There were only 100 of us, so I'll see if I know your cousin. Green Valley, you know where Green Valley Elementary School is? And then on the other side is the fire station. And nestled in between was All Saints Lutheran Church. I believe in my heart that Jesus removed the lampstand. Because now it's the Sunrise Living Center. It's no longer there, but that was the church we grew up. I was the janitor there. My parents ran the entire Sunday school program. Kids would come from all over the neighborhood, from Cameo and from all over the place. For my father, it was just awful. He would lead singing. He had the worst voice of anybody God ever created. I don't think God actually created his voice. I think it was from somewhere else. But he would lead these hymns, and all the kids would sing. And then my dad would take the junior high group. My mom would take the high school group. And they served this church like my whole life till we left there when I was in 8th grade. And what happened was we had this Pastor Knox, and I don't really remember ever talking to him. I don't know if you do, Jeff. I remember talking to him. He was old, and I mean old. It was just dust. It was just dust that would move around. Jeff and I were both acolytes. We loved to be acolytes. You put your robe on, you light the candle. It gave you something to do because it was so utterly boring. But my parents loved Pastor Knox. He was a godly man, and he retired. Maybe he just died. I don't know which one. And they were going to call a new pastor. And apparently this new guy came, and there was a meeting down at the church. And my dad went. And people were asking this pastor and his wife all kinds of questions. And come to find out, my father was the only one that asked this pastor a spiritual question. And they were going to call this guy to be the pastor at the church. And my father had asked him, what do you think about the Son of God? And he said, well, I don't really believe in the Son of God. He didn't believe in Jesus. That's a minor detail in the Christian church. What do you think about salvation? He said, well, I don't really think anybody really can be saved or know that they're saved. We just try to live a good life. And this went on and on like this. Only my dad asked him these questions. So we went one Sunday morning, and we always sat in the back left where there were 6 chairs. There were 6 of us, and that was our row. And I've shared this with you before. God help the person that sat in one of our seats. We would throw you out. And the church service got finished, and they were going to have a meeting, and we all stayed there. We all sat there. And they began to talk about how great this guy was. Well, he played, the guitar, and his wife sang, and there were all these kinds of things. And my dad stood, and my dad carefully asked them questions. Have any of you asked him about his faith? Have any of you asked him about his belief in the Word of God? Have any of you asked him about his sense of the Trinity and about Jesus? And it was fascinating. I was just a boy, and it was like yesterday. But he never told them what he knew. He never told them the answers this guy had given him. Isn't that fascinating? He was so calm. It was eerie. Even as a boy, I was next to my father, and he stood. He was a strong, powerful man. But he was eerily calm. And I couldn't figure it out because people began to turn and throw insults at him. You're ridiculous. You're being stupid. You're being argumentative. We have the perfect guy. What's wrong with you? I remember my dad saying with just this chilling, quiet, loving voice, if you call this man, I'll be forced to take my family and go somewhere else, and I don't want to do that. He was caring for this body of people. We all kind of know if we've lived here at least 3 days in this world, how miserable this place can be sometimes. It gets rough. And I don't mean that in some kind of defeatist, victimized way, but rather that life literally works against humanity all day, every day. The fact that we're actually shocked when life doesn't work is the shocking thing. Here's an experiment. Go home today and just do a small project. And after your 4th trip to Ace Hardware, you will realize life doesn't work. And that's just the small stuff. There are larger things where, and I mean this, the dark forces feel not almost, they feel coordinated, don't they? Have you ever had that where it feels like there's something coordinating difficulty against us? And I'm, of course, not talking about not being diligent, and then life doesn't fare well. Or not paying your taxes and then blaming the IRS for coming after you. I'm not talking about self-inflicted trouble, but rather you are simply strolling along in life and a dump truck of misery backs up on your head. And sometimes you can feel it coming, and it's still brutal. But quite often in these dark, coordinated assaults, we get blindsided. I remember the first time I figured this out, I was about 8 or 9 years old, and all 4 of my grandparents died in one summer. I mean, how does that happen? So when an entire church, literally an entire church, turned against my dad, after just this selfless life he'd given them, I could not figure out how he was so calm and loving and resolute. No raising his voice. Right? This is going to be a really hard Sunday. And it is well with my soul. That did not help. Terrible. Not uncontrolled anger. There was no lashing out. There was no, man, I wish I wouldn't have said that on that day. And we never went back, by the way. In fact, I knew how much he cared about these people. He was trying to bring them to a better spot, but not do it for them. He was testing for any desire for righteousness and truth. And his every single sentence was so wise and so thoughtful and calculated, trying to gently lead these people to the truth. That's the kind of passage we have this morning. We have this amazing parallel between Jesus and Peter. Even though they never speak in the story. 2 stories that go on simultaneously, literally feet from one another, that could not look any different. And one looks amazingly like my dad in my childhood at that church in Danville. The other looks a lot more like me. Maybe like you sometimes. So I want to take a peek at these 2 stories, and we know this story well, and I know we do. So maybe this morning will be more of a reminder. And I want to answer just 2 questions. First of all, what is different about their reaction to the storm, Jesus and Peter? And then why is their reaction so different? But first, I want to just set the scene so we know where they are in the story. Caiaphas is the acting high priest. His father-in-law Annas, has been the high priest, and he's the one that really pulls the power strings. And it appears from the text we have left the Garden of Gethsemane, and we now find ourselves in the high priest's house and courtyard, with Caiaphas present and his priestly guards there, even though Annas is the one questioning Jesus. Excavations in Jerusalem in the Jewish quarter have uncovered these like palatial mansions where the priests live in the top of the city's western side. It is now termed the Herodium quarters. We had a group of people just go there, and I'm sure you just witnessed this and saw these. They were spacious mansions for these high priests around an open courtyard. And the view looked out, and you could see the temple in the distance and the royal stoa and the Mount of Olives. It's a house of power and prestige. It's a place where people win. And Peter, it should be noted, by the way, is the only one other than John who actually follows Jesus inside Jerusalem. We blame Peter for the denials. At least he's there, right? At least he's there. Unfortunately, it doesn't go well. More than likely, John is there with him, and John is not harassed in any way, probably because, first of all, John is a boy. He's a teenager. He's not a threat. Second of all, it appears that John, the writer of our gospel, he knows the priestly family, and so they're not threatened by him. And Jesus is questioned by the high priest who is out for blood, and he somehow handles it with just this insane collect and calm. And simultaneously, Peter is denying he even knows Jesus, which is actually not accurate. He doesn't just deny Jesus. We learn in Matthew, he curses Jesus in Matthew 26. He curses Jesus. Again, I applaud him for at least being there, but boy, is he not there. So that's the backdrop to our scene. So let's look at these two people, Peter and Jesus, in parallel. Two individuals that are literally feet apart from one another, but they're a chasm apart in their mindset and in their hearts and in their reactions. So, first of all, what is different about their reaction to pressure? There are a whole bunch of things, and I just want to highlight three very quickly. And of course, I'm not the brightest guy, so I'll pick the most obvious ones. First of all, one is afraid and one is calm. And I know that comes right out of the Captain Obvious commercial. But I want you to just listen how calm Jesus is. They're going to kill this guy in a matter of hours. He stands bound before them, and they have complete power. He has nothing. And yet, I want you to just let the resolve and the calm of him pour over you as I read these verses. Verse 20, Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. It's almost chilling how calm Jesus is. And he gets smacked right in the mouth for this. And this is what comes out of his mouth next after getting smacked. Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about what is wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Again, who in this room would not kill to have this kind of calm, resolute, dare I say, relaxed spirit in the face of such turmoil? And what of Peter? Verse 16 says this, but Peter stood outside at the door. That's where he is physically, and that's where he is mentally and spiritually and emotionally. He's afraid of a servant girl. By the way, the Greek word means child, just to drive the point home. Second of all, one, Jesus is others-focused. The other is self-focused. And Tim talked about this last week when Peter cuts the main guard's ear off and Jesus puts it right back on. Well, this continues. Jesus, who is on a literal death march, still really only cares about others and not himself. So how do I see this in the passage? Well, what is one of the main goals of Annas, the high priest's father-in-law? Well, he doesn't just want to bury Jesus. He wants to bury this whole faith movement that Jesus has started. It's getting out of control. That means he doesn't just want Jesus. He wants to quell his followers. And mainly what he wants to quell is his disciples. And Jesus won't give them up. Verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Did you catch that? He's not just after what Jesus said. That's actually secondary at this point. Like, he knows Jesus is dead. He knows they were going to kill him. He wants to know who else there is that needs to be squashed. Jesus is so calm and so in the moment. Despite this assault, his only concern is to protect these followers while they curse him, while they wouldn't even enter the city to begin with. And what of Peter? Verse 17, Peter says, I am not. Verse 25, Peter says, I am not. Tim shared this last week. Jesus said, I am. I'm the self-existent one, but I'm not just the self-existent one. I am for the disciples. I am for humanity. I am trying to get you, even you, Annas, to come to reality. Peter is not. He's just I. And finally, one hovers above the conversation and one is mired beneath it. What do I mean by that? Have you ever, say, been in a room with people and then you just get blindsided? And you find yourself in the argument only to later say to yourself, why did I let them get me drugged down the hole like that? Have you ever had that happen? Where you're like, okay, I know this is gonna be difficult, but I'm gonna try to hold myself. And you get in there and people just start getting to you and they frustrate you and you lose your cool and you say to yourself, why did I allow them to pull me down in the mud with all of the rest of them? You're more frustrated with yourself than you are with them. It's a really lousy feeling. It's happened to me, I don't know, 1,000,000 times. Conversely, have you ever been in such a place inside your heart that you almost feel like you're hovering above the conversation like you're watching a movie? It's as if all of a sudden in that moment, you're a master chess player playing with a kindergartner, and you're seeing their every move 10 moves ahead. This is what Jesus is doing. When the priest asks Jesus the question, he doesn't bite on the hook. And that's exactly what it is. Everything Annas is asking Jesus is just a hook. And Jesus sees it this way. So rather than being pulled and dragged down into this just mud level, Jesus tests Annas for his own real hunger and interest in the truth. And when Jesus gets smacked right in the mouth, he isn't thrown because he is so anchored. But he's not just anchored, he's even open to being wrong. I mean, I love this. He says, look, if I'm wrong, just show me. I don't think it's like, if you think I'm wrong, show me, like I would do, because it's like, well, I know I'm not. How could I possibly be wrong? It's not that. I think he's so calm, he's like, it's okay if I'm wrong even. But you gotta tell me. I'm not copping to nothing. I'm not apologizing for you. I'll apologize for me, but not for you. See, Jesus' question is not empty. I think Jesus means it because he's so anchored. This is one of the biggest things I've learned in the last 10 years of my life, between 50 and 60. I for so long would just pour into people even when they weren't really receiving it. Then I realized if there's no hunger, they're never gonna eat. And so I may lay a piece of bread out, and if they don't take the bread, there's no way to put a piece of meat next to it. Do you know what I mean by that? I think this is what Jesus is doing. He wants to know, Annis, are you hungry? Annis, do you want to know truth, or are you just after something diabolical? Well, why? Why is Jesus able to do this so differently under pressure and Peter isn't? Now again, out of a page of Captain Obvious, but just so important, the answer is very simple. One is prepared and one is not. You know, the guy that discipled me in college, he always used to tell me, the time to prepare for war is not in the war. It's too late. The time to prepare for war is before you go to battle. It's today. It's every day. So what does this mean? How do we get prepared? I want to share two things, and they're not new. So you're going to go and get in the car today, and you're going to go, boy, you didn't tell me anything new today. That's my whole goal. First of all, we must give the Spirit something to work with by taking his truth in. We just studied this. I just taught a whole sermon on this. The Spirit, if you recall, reminds us. Do you remember that? The Spirit reminds us and teaches us, which then produces peace. We take it in, the Spirit reminds us, and then that makes us settled no matter what is going on. But he can only remind you about what you already know. This is what Jesus did his whole life. The letter to the Hebrews says Jesus learned obedience. He wasn't born a babe with supernatural power. He wasn't born a naked infant with explosive brain power that just figured everything out and already knew 15,000 languages before he even had his first poop in a diaper. Remember Philippians? He emptied himself. He set that aside. He became us. He had to learn the scriptures every day. He pored over the scriptures every day, on his own, in synagogue, with his family, with his friends. Peter was totally unprepared. How many times in the Gospels does it tell us, and yet the disciples did not grasp what they saw? When Jesus fed the 5,000, the disciples did not get what he meant. When Jesus said, you have to eat my flesh, his disciples called it a hard teaching. When Jesus calmed the storm, they said, what kind of man is this? We read this in the letter to the church of Ephesus in chapter 5. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities. Do you hear the coordination? They are after you. How's that for a Thanksgiving message? against the rulers, the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, because they are coordinating against you, therefore, because life doesn't work, therefore, because every single day life is and the dark forces are coming after you to make your life miserable. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. You know what that means? Winter's coming. Never thought I'd use a Game of Thrones reference up here. It is. The war's coming. To withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore. Here we go. Now he's going to start describing armor. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I was a poli-sci major. But in my estimation, there are 7 pieces of armor that are outlined in Ephesians chapter 5. 3 of them, by the way, have to do with taking in and knowing God's word and his reality and his truth. 3 of the 7. Again, not great at math, that's almost half. Your covered is fastened with truth. Your mind is guarded by the knowledge of the saving grace of God, that he died for you when you had nothing to do with him. Now what will he do for you now that he's your friend? If you've given your life to him. And finally, we carry the word within us, and the Spirit fends off nonsense thinking with it. See, when life gets hard, it's hard enough with what comes at us. But you know what makes it harder? Nonsense thinking. That's what makes it way worse. Something evil happens to you, and then we ascribe what Satan does to us to God. Why would God do this to me? God would never do that to you. God didn't do that to you, but you have nonsense thinking. And so now you took your torture and you made it 10 times worse because now you think God is against you. That's just one small example. Again, this is what we've already processed together. You will not wake up in 20 or 30 years and just be wiser and more calm in the face of adversity. You love this part, don't you, Tom Aftal? This is not in the notes. That's what you wanted to hear, isn't it? My dad died Thursday. I thought, see, that groan, you guys all thought I was just being Tammy Faye up here, didn't you? We had 26 people coincidentally coming to my house, all family. And my mother comes down and we sit down. We're having this meal, and my sister is always trying to make things deep, darn her. She said, hey, how about we go around the table and say we're thankful for? And so one by one, all of us went around this giant table of ours and just said what we were thankful for. And we got to the very end, there was my mom, who just lost her husband after 69 years. And she shared what she was thankful for, the life God had given her. And that was incredible enough. And then she took the podium. Didn't she? And about 20 years ago, this would have kind of ticked me off. Like, stop telling me what to do. And boy, did I not feel that way on Thursday. It was like, you know what, lady? You're 88. Do what you want. You say what you want. Let it out. And she said 2 things. And she said them more than once. She said them over and over and over for about 5 minutes. She said, follow Jesus and get in his word. I was dumbfounded. But you're going to say, yeah, that's because you're a pastor that doesn't get paid. Of all the things she was going to tell 3 generations around this table, One of them was get in his word every day. Why would she tell us that? Follow Jesus, I get that. Every day, get in his word. And then she said, or you will never, and she pointed the circle around the table, or you will never have this. And so, since she told me, I'm going to tell you. It's not hard. Listen to a sermon. Get a devotional. Read a proverb. Don't let one day go by in your life without opening up the scriptures and letting God say something to you. To give the Spirit something to work with. Amen? Could you imagine the groaning of the Spirit within you if you know Jesus? And if you don't, all you have to do is acknowledge his Son. But if you do, you have the Spirit of the living Christ within you. And he's groaning. I want you to feel this. This is not a guilt statement. This is a plea to help your thinking. Give him something to tell you. The second thing, Jesus broke before God. And Peter stood and tripped. You got to remember what just took place. And John's gospel does not tell us. But we know from the other gospels that they just spent time in the Garden of Gethsemane. And remember, Jesus kneels and prays, and he grabs his three closest friends, Peter and James and John, and he pulls them closer and he says, pray with me. And you all know the story. Jesus pours his heart out to the Father and says, if we cannot do this, it would be fantastic. But what I want is not important. Your will be done. And then he would look over and all three guys would be asleep. And then he would go back and he would pour his heart out to the Father. And he would look over and they would be asleep. 3 times in agony and utter brokenness. Jesus begs his closest friends to stay awake and to pray. And oh, by the way, I don't even think he was asking them to pray for him. I think it was for them. And this is the important distinction. Jesus knows he's going to die, but he does not know every single little thing that is going to happen. Remember, he has emptied himself to become a man. He relies on the Spirit to guide him. But he knows the dark forces are going to coordinate their assault against him. He knows he must break before God to feel his own frailty, to feel his own weakness, to allow the Father to impart his strength into him through the Spirit. Darn it, God keeps telling me stuff. Leave me alone. My dad died, and my brother and his wife, Lori, Linda and me, and my sister, Sherry, were just in the family room with my dad, laying in his bed, still warm. We were letting my mom sleep. I really don't want to share this stuff. One day I will. We finally decided the mortuary was coming to get my dad. We got to wake my mom up. So it was, without speaking, only Jeff and Sherry and I went back. The spouses stayed. And Jeff went in first, and I made sure I stood behind him. He's the oldest between he and I. And he went in and said to my mom, woke her up and said, Dad's passed. The first thing I heard her say to him was, give me a few minutes to be with my Lord. And he consoled her for a minute, just a minute. And then I didn't let her have a minute with the Lord because I needed a minute with her. So I went up and I spent a minute with my mom and just spoke into her ear and kissed her and hugged her. And then I left and hemorrhaged, and my sister went in. She consoled her for a minute. She told me later, she said, well, you know what Mom did, right? And I said, no. She said, gosh, I'm glad I don't have makeup on. She said, Mom rolled over and slid onto her knees. Her feet never touched the floor. And we wait, right? And we waited for 10 or 15 minutes. By then, Linda had gone and gotten my son, Scott. My sister's fiance was there. And my mother walked out. And from the moment she walked out, she never stopped ministering to every single person in that family until she finally crawled back in her covers. How did she do that? How did she do that? Because she slumped on the floor before her God. And she poured out her soul. She stood in strength. I have no idea where I am. Not shockingly, the seventh piece of armor in Ephesians, you'll never guess what it is. Verse 18. Sorry, that was loud. Praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance. Praying at all times in the Spirit. You see, Jesus' struggle in this time and in this prayer is with a diabolical assault. And when Jesus gets up, he is a different dude, like my mother was. He is the man. He's exhausted. He's rejected. He's poured out completely. He's physically beaten beyond recognition. And now almost completely abandoned by every friend he ever had. And he doesn't miss a beat. Not before the guards, not before the high priest, not before Pilate, not before the Sanhedrin, not before Herod, not before his disciples' inability to stick with him, not before the thief on the cross that would cast insults upon him, and not even before the cross itself. Jesus faces a diabolical assault. And he breaks before God through a time of agonizing in prayer. And he stands in favor and strength and resolve and calm and wisdom and nothing but a concern for how the other person's doing. Oh, do not weep for me, he says. Right? I weep for you. It is unworldly what Jesus does. It's exactly what I watched my dad do in the church. I'm going to need a big nap today. But see, it's only because I wrote this sermon 3 weeks ago, people. Somehow the three of them were up there, were laughing, telling me, like, boy, he doesn't even know what he's writing. See, this was my posture, the posture of my father. And I'm not turning around. Every day, every single freaking day of my dad's life, he was on his knees. He was not perfect. If you have an hour, I can sit with you and tell you things he did wrong. I won't, because they're so meaningless, I can't even tell you. He was David. He was a man after God's own heart. And not because he was perfect, but because he stayed the course. when Jesus woke those guys up the third time, the verses say it was too late. They had lost their opportunity. It's a chilling statement. They had lost their opportunity. Peter could not do any better than Peter's strength could muster. That's as good as Peter was going to get. That's as good as you and I are going to get, by the way, if we stand and walk. We need to fall before God. Amen. Every day. We need to read what he says to us every day, no matter how small it is. Let me just finish with this verse. I love this passage in 1 Peter. Humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. How about, is the verse up behind me? How about read it with me? That way when I can't read, I can just listen to you. Humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you. Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experience of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ. And all God's people said.